Welcome to the ODOT training on underserved populations. In this first lesson, you will learn how ODOT complies with environmental justice, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 laws, and related regulations and executive orders. For most users, this lesson takes about 30 minutes to complete. The guidance provided in this course is intended to assist ODOT district environmental staff, consultants, and local public agencies, LPAs. These standards must be followed for all categorical exclusion, C1 through D3, EA, and EIS environmental documents. Additionally, federally funded LPA projects that require the preparation of an environmental document also must follow this guidance. Let's begin by familiarizing ourselves with the relevant legislation and important terms, starting with Nepa. After that, we will explore how ODOT ensures compliance through its underserved populations guidance. Since 1970, Nepa has been the overarching law protecting the environment and its connection to the well-being of people. In part, Nepa requires consideration of adverse economic, social, and environmental impacts during development of transportation projects receiving federal aid. In addition to Nepa, many other laws regulate how federal projects, programs, and policies impact both the environment and people. Let's examine a handful of the most relevant ones, beginning with Executive Order 12898, which addresses environmental justice impacts to minority and low-income populations. While the term environmental justice can conjure many different images and meanings, the term has a very specific connotation. Which of the following do you think is the key concern for environmental justice? Select an image below. Environmental justice is concerned with the impact of proposed programs or policies on the people living nearby, specifically minority and low-income groups. The 1970s saw the establishment of broad anti-discrimination and environmental protection laws. Then, in the early 1980s, activists and legislators advanced specific issues, including how federal undertakings tended to cause disproportionate environmental impacts to minority and low-income populations. For example, landfills were increasingly located near these populations, while road widening projects and new highways introduced traffic, disrupted access, and severed community ties. Environmental justice eventually emerged from this concern about inequality. In 1994, President Clinton signed Executive Order 12898, effectively requiring all federal agencies to identify and address the effects of their actions on minority and low-income populations. The FHWA defines EJ as identifying and addressing disproportionately high and adverse effects of programs, policies, and activities on minority and low-income populations. This includes ensuring full and fair participation in the transportation decision-making process for these populations. We will define disproportionately high and adverse effects and full and fair participation later in this lesson. For now, let's focus on what minority and low-income populations are. Minority populations include 5 different groups. Click each to learn more. A person having origins in any of the black racial groups of Africa. A person of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South American, or the Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. A person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. A person having origins in any of the original people of North America and who maintain cultural identification through tribal affiliation or community recognition. A person having origins in Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific island. For EJ, low income refers to a median household income that is at or below the Department of Health and Human Services poverty guidelines. In 2017, a 4-person household met low-income criteria if its total combined income was $24,600 or less. The chart below depicts other household sizes and income levels for the same year. The Department of Health and Human Services revises the poverty guidelines annually and publishes them online. While EJ focuses on minority and low-income populations specifically, additional anti-discrimination policies, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, recognize other populations. Let's explore this keystone law now, and then we'll discuss legislation prohibiting discrimination on the basis of age, ability, or language proficiency. The Civil Rights Act was crafted to prevent discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. Title VI of the Act prohibits federal agencies or any entity utilizing federal funds from denying persons equal participation in programs or activities, including the receiving of benefits. Let's compare EJ and Title VI. EJ has a narrower scope of statutory and regulatory requirements. EJ considers only disproportionately high and adverse effects on minority and low-income populations. Title VI accounts for environmental impacts in addition to more subtle or remote forms of discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. There is overlap between EJ and Title VI. For example, minority populations may also be protected under Title VI due to their race, color, and/or national origin. However, EJ analysis alone will not necessarily satisfy Title VI requirements. This means that, to comply with regulations, federal agencies, including ODOT, must conduct comprehensive investigations into how their processes and projects could discriminate against all protected populations. Now that you understand the basics of EJ and Title VI, let's look at legislation prohibiting discrimination on the basis of age, disability, or limited English proficiency. These laws broadened the scope of protections for Title VI and redefined how federal agencies, including ODOT, ensure compliance. There are 4 key laws that expanded the protections of Title VI to include age, disability, and limited English proficiency. Click the buttons on the left to explore each. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies or which receive federal financial assistance. The Act also prohibits discrimination in federal employment and employment practices of federal contractors. The Age Discrimination Act of 1975 ensures equal participation in and receipt of benefits from federally funded programs or activities. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 requires governmental and private entities to comply with standards of accessibility that help people with disabilities participate more completely in society. Title II of the Act outlines requirements for state and local government services. Executive Order 13166 requires federal agencies to develop and implement a system for providing services to people with limited English proficiency, or LEP. The Department of Justice publishes LEP Guidance, a document outlining compliance standards. The anti-discrimination legislation you just learned about established comprehensive protections for diverse populations. In this section, we will focus on ODOT's Underserved Populations Guidance, which is a method for upholding these protections. Let's get started. Together, the laws we worked through require ODOT to comply with anti-discrimination policies when participating in a federal action or utilizing federal funds. These laws also collectively define what are known as underserved populations. Underserved populations have traditionally been excluded from participating in and enjoying the benefits of U.S. democracy, culture, and economy. In other words, they have been historically discriminated against due to a lack of political, cultural, and economic power. Note that these populations often overlap. For example, many people with disabilities are also older and live at or below the poverty level. ODOT considers traditionally underserved populations throughout the project development process, with the goal of avoiding negative impacts if possible. When avoidance is not possible, ODOT makes every effort to minimize and/or mitigate the impacts. In doing so, ODOT must evaluate and document environmental impacts, seek input from affected populations, and address negative impacts before making a decision and initiating a project. The level of measures to address impacts and/or effects will depend on the context and intensity of the project as well as common sense. These measures must consider all affected underserved populations to ensure the equitable distribution of benefits and burdens related to the project. What exactly are disproportionately high and adverse effects? To answer this question, let's look at definitions and examples from the FHWA Order 6640.23a. Click on each card to learn more. Disproportionately high and adverse effects are predominantly borne by minority and low-income populations. They are more severe or greater in magnitude than those experienced by non-underserved populations. Disproportionately high and adverse effects include significant individual or cumulative impacts to human health or the environment. Examples include, but are not limited to, air, noise, water, and soil pollution, bodily impairment, infirmity, illness, or death, destruction of aesthetic values, destruction or disruption of human-made or natural resources. Cumulative effects are not immediately obvious. They include the total of all impacts that have occurred, are occurring, or will likely occur as the result of an action. Cumulative effects may be direct and reasonably foreseeable indirect impacts. Disproportionately high and adverse effects encompass interrelated social and economic burdens. Examples include, but are not limited to, destruction or disruption of community cohesion or economic vitality, destruction or disruption of access to public and private facilities and services, adverse employment effects, displacement of persons, businesses, farms, and non-profit organizations, denial, reduction, or significant delay in the receipt of benefits of programs, policies, or activities. What happens if a project or action could have a discriminatory and disproportionately high and adverse effect on underserved populations? You already know that agencies must determine impacts and develop measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate them. What other steps are required? Click each topic to find out. ODOT is required to consider project alternatives that avoid and/or minimize disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental impacts. ODOT must incorporate public involvement opportunities and consider the results of public involvement. This includes providing the public with meaningful access to information concerning human health or environmental impacts. ODOT must solicit input from affected populations in considering alternatives during the planning stages of the project. Let's put into plain language how ODOT's underserved population guidance works. There are 4 basic steps. Click the buttons for each, starting with number 1. 1. Identify underserved populations. 2. Assess impacts to underserved populations. 3. Address impacts to underserved populations. 4. Document process, including applicable data, public involvement, decisions made, and, if required, an underserved populations impact analysis report. Congratulations! You have completed this lesson on EJ, Title VI, and other legislation protecting underserved populations. In Lesson 2, you will learn about how ODOT complies with anti-discrimination policies set forth by these laws, regulations, executive orders, and requirements.